Okay, good evening. Welcome to our class. And it happens to be a very auspicious beginning because we are starting to read the second book of the Torah. What's the name of the second book? Everyone would say Exodus, and that's not wrong. It is the book that features the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt. And there are many other central themes of this book. It's the bondage, first of all. The Jews were slaves in Egypt. The exodus from Egypt, the splitting of the sea, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, the manna from heaven, the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. These are all major themes. But you know what? The real name of this book, the primary name, is not Exodus, but Shemot, which means names, because it starts off with the words, and these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Why would you name a book names? These are the names. The book should be named after one of its central themes: Exodus, Sinai, splitting of the sea, the construction of the temple. But yet, the name that we most often use is Shemos, names. So the reason given in the Midrash is that the Jewish people, though they were slaves in Egypt, they never lost their Jewish identity. They always remembered that they were Jews. They didn't change their names. In those days, the only way you could show your identity was to keep your name. Even though they were in Egypt, they did not change their names. And that kept them from totally assimilating. You see, the Jewish people were put into this world for a mission. We have to be different. And if we think we're not different, the anti-Semites of the world remind us that we are different. And the reason why we're different is because we have a special mission. Our mission is to be a light to the nations. That's what the prophet Isaiah tells us. We have to be a light to the nations. But in order to be a light to the nations, we have to recognize who we are as Jews. And in order for us to preserve that individuality and that independence that we are Jews, God put us through two tests when we were in Egypt. One test was the test of persecution. If you came from the Soviet Union, you know what that is. They persecuted Jews, crushed them, did whatever they can do to destroy their identity as Jews. But then there's another test, and that's called the test of assimilation by enticing them. And that's what we have in America and in the Western world. We have the test of assimilation. Now, the Jews, before they became a nation at Mount Sinai, God put them through the Egyptian bondage where they were subjected to both tests. They had one test of persecution, and the other test was the threat of assimilation. They were in Egypt 210 years. They could have very easily assimilated. So the Torah tells us, you know what the secret of the Jewish people's ability to be liberated from Egypt? If they had assimilated, that would have been the end of them. They would have gone, just like most other nations when they move to a country. People come from all sorts of cultures. They come to America. America became the melting pot. And Jews, not Jews, but other nations, other ethnicities disappeared. The Jewish people will never disappear because even when we go down in our Jewishness, we don't lose our identities. That's what happened in Egypt. That's why the book is called the Book of Names, because it's trying to tell you the secret of our survival was we didn't change our names. So the Torah starts off by telling us these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, and then it lists the names of the 12 sons of Jacob. And then it tells us that there were a total of 70 people that came to Egypt with Jacob. And then it adds, and Joseph was in Egypt. Well, if we remember what we studied in the end of the book of Genesis, we know that Joseph was in Egypt. Why does the Torah have to emphasize that? So Rashi is the most important commentary of the Torah, lived over 900 years ago. He says that this is to teach us that in spite of the fact that he lived in Egypt, and not only did he live in Egypt, he became like the king. He was the viceroy, the second to the king. He had tremendous power. He remained the same Joseph that he was when he lived with his father. He never lost his spirituality. He never lost his commitment to the belief in one God. Living in Egypt was very easy to become pagan, to start worshiping many gods. Joseph never lost not only his identity. None of the Jews lost their identity, but he did not lose even all of his spiritual achievements. He remained faithful to everything that his father Jacob taught him. Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold by his brothers. And in those 17 years, his father instilled within him a very profound attachment to God and to the virtues that were passed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. That's why the Torah emphasizes that in spite of the fact that Joseph was in Egypt, he remained the same righteous Joseph. But then Joseph dies, so do his brothers die, and that whole generation is gone. And now the children of Israel, the family, is spreading out, they're proliferating. The Jews are growing by leaps and bounds. And a new king arose on Egypt who did not know Joseph. What does that mean, he didn't know Joseph? So there are two opinions, Rashi quotes. One opinion says that this was a new king, and he didn't know Joseph. He wasn't aware of the history of his own country, that Joseph saved the country. But then Rashi said, no, it's the same Pharaoh. He made himself as if he didn't know Joseph, which means that he was even more wicked. Joseph saved Egypt, and here the king should have been so grateful, and he forgot about Joseph. Now, what does it mean that they didn't know Joseph? It's hard to understand that he made believe he didn't know Joseph. That I can understand. He wasn't a nice person. He wasn't a good person. But what does it mean that it was a new king and he didn't know Joseph? How could he be so ignorant not to know Joseph? So one way of explaining it is, when Joseph was appointed by Pharaoh to be the viceroy, he gave him a new name. His new name was not Joseph, but Safnat Paneach. Those apparently are Egyptian words. What do they mean? The one who reveals the hidden. Because he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams that were hidden from Pharaoh's own understanding. So Joseph was able to decipher secrets. That's what the name was given to Joseph. What does Joseph mean? Joseph means to add, to increase. What's the difference between these two names? The difference is the first name recognizes that everything is contained within nature. There's nothing above and beyond nature. Everything is contained within nature. Some things are hidden, some things are revealed. And Pharaoh recognized that Joseph was able to discover the things that are hidden. But Joseph means much more than that. Joseph means he's able to create a revolution, to change things radically, to transform the world. That's ultimately what the Jewish people are here for, to transform the world, not just to find the secrets within nature. That too, that we also have an obligation to do, to look deeper into nature, but to recognize that there's something more than what is embedded in nature. So when it says that the king didn't know Joseph, it means he knew Joseph's other name. He knew Joseph was able to discover the meaning of embedded secrets, but that Joseph was able to add something, a new dimension, because that's what, when God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai, it was a new dimension, a new energy, and that's what Joseph represents. That he didn't know, that he didn't recognize. That's why later on when Moses approaches Pharaoh and says that God told him to let the people go, Pharaoh says, I don't know God. What does it mean, I don't know God? He constantly referred to God. But God had two different names. One name is Elohim, which means the God within nature. And the other one is, we don't even know how to pronounce it, but the other one has in it the words in Hebrew that mean past, present, and future, all contained within one word. That means God is above and beyond time. If you're beyond time, you're beyond everything. So Pharaoh says, I recognize that there's a God. I believe in a God. He believed in many gods, but I could tolerate you believing in one God as well. But as long as you recognize that God is identical or synonymous with nature, that God is a natural force. A lot of pagans believe in God, but they believe God and nature is one thing. The American Indians believed in spirits, that nature's, all different natural forces are different spirits. That's not what Judaism believes in. Judaism believes that God is a creator. He created everything out of nothing. God is more than just the force within nature. He's that too. He's a force within nature, but he's above and beyond everything. So Pharaoh says, I know that there's a concept of a God, but I can't recognize there's a concept that a God transcends nature. He transcends time and space. That he couldn't recognize. So what happens? He says to his people, we have a problem here, the Jewish problem. All the anti-Semites have a Jewish problem. This Jewish nation is growing by leaps and bounds. We have to find a way of dealing with them. Because what will happen if a war will break out and they'll join our enemies and they will leave the land. Rashi says he really meant to say, they'll make us leave, but he didn't want to say that openly. So what did he do? He appointed taskmasters to afflict them with their hard work. Now the Hebrew word for hard work, sivlo sum, their hard work, has another meaning as well. It also means tolerance. He afflicted them with tolerance. What does that mean? How do you afflict someone with tolerance? Tolerance sounds like a good thing. If you could tolerate negativity, if you could tolerate exile, then you're in big trouble. One of the things that happens when a person is enslaved, after a while they become comfortable with it and they identify with it. It's called the Stockholm syndrome, where someone is taken as a hostage. Some of you might remember Patty Hearst when she was taken as a hostage, kidnapped, and then years later she was among those who robbed banks for her people. She became one of them. So that they I don't know where the term Stockholm Syndrome originated, but what it means is that you become a victim and then you identify with your tormentor, with your captor, and you become one with them. And that's what happens when Jews are in exile. When you're in exile, at first you resist it, you can't tolerate it, and then gradually you begin to tolerate it, you begin to accept it. That happened when many Jews came over from Europe in the beginning of the 20th century, and they didn't like America because America didn't let them practice Judaism. They couldn't keep Shabbos, they couldn't keep kosher, they couldn't give their children a Jewish education. Not because of persecution as in the Soviet Union, but because America was different. But after a while, they began to tolerate it. They began to say, well, this is life and we'll accept it. And that's something that is the worst part of being a slave, being in exile, that you can tolerate it. That's a Hasidic interpretation of these words, in order to afflict them with their tolerance, that not only were they being persecuted, but they began to tolerate the persecution. And when you begin to tolerate it, you don't try to leave it. And indeed, later on, when the Jews finally left Egypt, not all Jews left. There was a significant number of Jews who said, we don't want to leave Egypt, and they stayed behind. But it didn't work. The Jewish people started to grow, they proliferated, and the Egyptians afflicted the Jewish people with, the Hebrew word is used as parach. Parach was translated as back-breaking labor. They tortured them with back-breaking labor. But in the Talmud, there are two opinions what that means. Some say it's not back-breaking labor. It means, the word perach is actually a composite of two words. Peh, mouth, rach, soft, a soft mouth. What does that mean? How was Pharaoh going to get the Jewish people, who were honored citizens up until that point, to become slaves? It's not easy to enslave a whole group of people, a whole nation of people. By that time, there were tens of thousands of Jews. How do you enslave them? So he realized that the way to do it is to entice them. So he started a project of rebuilding Egypt, a major project where every citizen was asked to contribute to the rebuilding of Egypt, and they would be paid for it. And it would be considered a patriotic duty. And the king himself, Pharaoh himself, went to the places where they were building, and he himself participated in building. How could you say no when Pharaoh himself is involved? And the Jews were very patriotic. That's one of our strengths and one of our weaknesses. Jews are very patriotic. No matter where we are, we try to pay homage to the host country that lets us in and protects us and gives us opportunities. So the Jews started working. Little by little, they started cutting the pay. But they're still working, and then they cut the pay altogether. And the Jews complain, says, look, this is a patriotic duty. And then the Egyptians started to withdraw from the sites where they were doing the construction. And when the Jews realized that they were now regimented into a workforce without getting paid, without having the ability to leave, it was too late. They were already regimented by Pharaoh's taskmasters. So that's what it means by perach, a soft mouth. What is a soft mouth? It was enticing. He didn't just come with the whips and right away beat them. He came to them with enticement. This is something you're going to want to do. You're going to want to be part of this rebuilding of Egypt, getting paid for it and everything. And this has ramifications at the Seder. If you remember, at the Seder, we eat matzah, we drink wine, but what else do we eat?
Bitter herbs.
Bitter herbs. What are bitter herbs? So most people will tell you horseradish, chrein. In Russian, it's chrein.
Did they really have horseradish in Egypt?
No. We eat horseradish. Because they were embittered, because life was bitter for them, so we eat bitter stuff. But the Talmud says that there are actually 5 kinds of vegetables that qualify for bitter herbs. We only know with certainty the identity of 2 of them. One of them is chrein, is horseradish, and the other one is romaine lettuce. So the Talmud says, one second, romaine lettuce is not bitter. Maybe it's not sweet, but it's not bitter. And the answer is that if you leave the stalks in the ground for a long time, they become very, very bitter, almost inedible. And if you want to know, so if you have a choice of using romaine lettuce or horseradish, which one should you use? The Talmud says use the romaine lettuce. Why? Because it describes what happened in Egypt far better. It starts off sweet and pleasant and edible, and it becomes extremely bitter. So, but many Jews have a custom, that's the Chabad custom, to do both, to eat romaine lettuce with horseradish. I was at the Seder with a Rabbi, and Rabbi would take horseradish and squeeze it together. He had about maybe like 2-3 inches worth, and thick like this, and wrap it up in one leaf of romaine lettuce. And I think he was doing it to feel the bitterness of the Jewish people, that experiences their own bitterness by him feeling the strength of the horseradish. At any rate, that's what he means by the soft labor. It ended with hard back-breaking labor. Maybe that's why we eat the horseradish, because we really feel the bitterness, but it started off very softly. What happens? his astrologers told him that the Jews are going to leave. A savior will be born. Someone will be born that will lead the Jews to freedom. They didn't know who that would be, but they said it's going to happen. So what does the Pharaoh do? He calls in the Jewish midwives. One of them was called Shifra, one was called Puah. And our sages tell us that these were not their real names. These were the nicknames. Their real names were Yocheved, Moses' mother, and Miriam, Moses' sister. These were the head midwives. And he said, when you help to deliver the babies, if you see any boy, kill him. The girls could be allowed to live. And these women feared God, and they didn't listen to the king, and the king confronts them. Why didn't you listen? You let the children live. And they said, we can't help it. The children were born before we were able to get to them. So Pharaoh realizes that that plan is not going to work. So he starts another plan, that any baby that's born, any boy that's born, to be thrown into the Nile. And a man from the house of Levi marries or remarries the daughter of Levi. And she gives birth to a son, and she sees that he's good. And this is, of course, Moses. What does that mean, that a mother sees her baby is good? Do you know a mother that looks at her baby and says, "Oy, disgusting"? Obviously, the mother thinks the baby is good. So our sages, again, recognize that the Torah means something more than just a mother's thinking of that her child is good. So Rashi quotes one opinion of the Talmud that when Moses was born, he lit up the whole house. They realized that this is an unusual child. Another opinion says that he was born circumcised, which indicated that there's something about this child, that this child has some measure of perfection, even born that way. Whichever explanation one follows, they can both be true. This is a unique child, and she hid him for 3 months. Why did she have to hide him for 3 months? And why not more than 3 months? Because the Egyptians registered when Moses' father and mother remarried. There's a whole story. They were married, but they divorced. Why did they divorce? Because Amram, Moses' father, says, what's the point in having children if the boys will be thrown into the Nile? We're better off not having children. When Amram, who was the Jewish leader at that time, did what he did, all the other families broke apart. People realized, what's the point in having children? Miriam saved the day. Miriam, Moses' older sister, said to her father, Dad, you're worse than Pharaoh. Pharaoh is only killing the boys. You're going to prevent girls from being born. There will be no Jewish children. And Amram realized that his daughter was right, so he remarries Yocheved, Moses' mother. As soon as they remarried, the Egyptians realized that a baby could be born in 9 months. So they counted 9 months, but the baby was born prematurely in 6 months. So she was able to hide him for 3 months. After that, it was not possible. So what does she do? She puts him in a little basket and puts the basket on the Nile, in the Nile. And Miriam is waiting there to see what's going to happen. What does it mean she was waiting what was going to happen? She knew, she was a prophet, she knew that Moses will be saved. Although they're throwing baby boys in the Nile, and Moses, the mother puts him in the Nile. What do you expect? He's going to be saved? No, she knew he would be saved. And Pharaoh's daughter, whose name was Bitya, we now use the pronunciation Batya, it's a woman's name. She goes to bathe, and she sees this basket, and she stretches out her arm, and she takes the basket, and she realizes it's a Jewish boy, and she takes him into the palace, and so on and so forth. But what's interesting over here, it says she sends her arm. It could have just said, and she took the basket. Obviously, you use your arm to take things. So some say the word for arm doesn't mean arm, it means her maid. She sent her maidservant to get the basket. But there's another opinion that says that she couldn't reach the basket, and her arm miraculously stretched out. And that reminds me of a story. What time is it? Okay. Of a story that happened. I used to teach a class at UB about the Holocaust, and I would bring a book with stories of the true stories of the Holocaust by a woman called Yafa Elayach. It's called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. And I would usually tell a story, and then for some reason, the book I couldn't find the story that I prepared. So I just let whatever the book opened to, there was a crack in the book, so it opened to a story. I said, I'll read this story. And this is the story. The author of the book went to a butcher, or baker, not a butcher, a baker, to buy something. And the baker, and she tells the baker that there was her child was in an accident. It was the kind of accident where wearing a seatbelt would have been dangerous, they wouldn't have been able to get out of the car in time. So the child was not wearing a seatbelt, and that's what saved the child. Because if there would be in a seatbelt, the child would be trapped inside. So the baker says, no. It would never be trapped. A mother would be able to do whatever she has to do to save her child. Nothing will stop the mother from doing it. And then he told a personal story with himself that during the Holocaust, the Germans were rounding up people, and who knows what they did. And this baker's sister was taken by the Gestapo and imprisoned. And when he comes home and his mother tells him that the sister was taken away, he says, I'm going to go to the Gestapo and get her back. And the mother says, please don't go. It's enough to lose one child. I'm not going to lose two. But he runs to the Gestapo and he barges in, and they look at him with amusement. This Jew is coming to his own death. He says, what do you do with my beautiful sister? Give her back to me. And one of them says, if you can grow hair on the palm of your hand, you can have your sister. He opens up the palm of his hand, and there's hair coming out of it. And they went crazy. And they said, get your sister, get out of here as soon as you... And that's how she was saved, and he was saved. And then he opens up his hand to Yafa Elayach, the author of the book, and he shows that he had hair there. He says, how did he have hair? He says, when he was a child, they had to graft some skin from his leg onto his palm of his hand. The doctor said it would never grow hair. He says, my hand didn't go to medical school, and it did grow hair. And he said, but even if I didn't have that graft, to save my sister, my hand would have grown that hair. And that's the idea over here. To save a child, she was able to, this miracle happened that she was able to stretch out her hand. If a person really is committed to doing something in a time of emergency, you have incredible powers. There's stories of how people were able to lift a car off a child. Frail woman was able to do that because in a time of emergency, you get new strength, hidden strength. So now, Miriam is watching, and she says to the daughter of Pharaoh, should I call a nursing woman to nurse the child? Because the child apparently did not want to nurse from any of the Egyptian women. So the daughter of Pharaoh says, okay, get a Jewish nurse. And she calls the mother of the child. So the mother is now nursing her own child in the palace of Pharaoh. And he grows up in Pharaoh's palace. And one day he goes out, when he becomes an adult, he goes out and he sees a taskmaster beating a Jew mercilessly. And he looks here and he looks there, and he doesn't see anyone, and he kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. So one of the great rabbis who lived in Poland before the war, and actually he was a member of the Polish parliament, Rabbi Meir Shapiro, very famous rabbi. There were two very famous rabbis who were in the Polish parliament before the Holocaust. and they both passed. One passed away before, about a year, I think, before the Holocaust. One passed away in the Holocaust. He was murdered. Anyhow, Rabbi Shapiro said that there's a deeper understanding of this. What does that mean that Pharaoh, that Moses looked here, he looked there? When Jews, and it's a lesson for all of Jewish history, when Jews are being persecuted, and you think you're going to get salvation from people on the right, no, they're not going to help you. Then you look to the left, and the left certainly doesn't help. That's when Moses realized that Jewish people have to depend on themselves and, of course, on God. They're not going to get help from the right or the left. It's a very important lesson. While we try to get the best out of our government, and we think that this candidate will be better than the other, we should never put our trust in any political force, whether it's right or left. We have to just depend on God and on our own efforts that God wants us to do. It's the famous maxim, God helps those who help themselves, but it's God who's going to help us. And Moses realized that no one's going to stop up, no one's going to come to defend the Jew.